The sun was beginning its slow descent beyond the horizon, casting long golden rays across the rugged plains of the American West. The sky, once a pale blue, had now turned into a canvas of fiery orange, deep crimson, and soft lavender. Dust swirled gently in the warm breeze, and the only sounds to be heard were the faint rustling of dry sagebrush and the rhythmic clop of hooves against the hard, sun-baked earth. Jim Carson, a lone cowboy with weathered boots and a wide-brimmed hat that had seen better days, sat atop his tired old horse. Buck, both rider and steed, looked worn from a long journey, their silhouettes framed by the ever-darkening sky. Jim wasn't headed anywhere in particular. Like many cowboys of his kind, he lived a wandering life, moving from one cattle drive to another, helping wherever work called, and never staying long enough to make roots. He carried only the essentials: a saddlebag with a half-empty canteen, a rusted tin cup, a few cartridges for his revolver, and a single wrapped piece of bread, all that remained of his rations from the week. The road had been hard. He hadn't eaten since morning, and even then, it was little more than a few dry beans he'd soaked overnight. He'd hoped to make it to the next town by nightfall, but the trail was slower than expected, and fatigue had begun to set in. His stomach growled in protest as he glanced at the bread tucked in his saddlebag, but he chose to ignore it for now. Hunger was an old friend, and Jim had learned long ago how to keep company with it without letting it take over his mind. As the last rays of sunlight kissed the tops of distant hills, a sense of calm settled over the land, the kind of calm that only exists out in the open country, untouched by machines, unhurried by time. There were no town clocks ticking, no bar brawls, no smoke rising from chimneys, just the whisper of the wind, the endless stretch of land, and the quiet beating of a man's heart. Jim often found solace in these moments, when the world seemed to stand still. Despite his solitary existence, or perhaps because of it, he had grown to appreciate the simple beauty of an empty sky, or the way the stars revealed themselves one by one, like shy children peeking out from behind curtains. There was peace in solitude, a kind of peace he doubted most city folks would ever understand. He reached a slight rise in the land and paused for a moment to look out over the valley below. It was a view he'd seen many times before, the same rolling hills, the same dusky pallor of evening, yet it never failed to take his breath away. The land felt alive, as if it had its own memory, as if it had witnessed the struggles and joys of all who had passed through it. Cowboys, settlers, native tribes, outlaws, and wanderers like himself. Jim adjusted his hat and exhaled slowly. He felt the weariness in his bones, not just from the day's ride, but from a lifetime of hard travel, long nights, and uncertain mornings. He was only in his early 40s, but the deep lines etched into his face made him look older. Life on the trail had a way of aging a man faster than time itself. The horse let out a soft grunt, sensing Jim's thoughts and perhaps his hunger. He patted Buck's neck gently and muttered, "Just a little further, partner. We'll find a place to rest soon." Jim had spotted a small grove of trees in the distance, enough cover for a campfire and maybe even a stream nearby. It wasn't much, but it would do. He took one last glance at the twilight sky before nudging Buck forward again. The stars had started to blink into view, and night was beginning to stretch its fingers across the sky. Jim didn't know it yet, but this quiet evening, this peaceful ride through fading light, was the beginning of a story that would change his life forever. A story that would begin, not with a gunshot or a shout, but with a single piece of bread and a silent act of kindness. As Jim Carson continued down the lonely trail, dusk settled fully over the plains. The brilliant reds and oranges of the sunset had faded into a cool indigo, and the sky was beginning to reveal its first stars. The evening air grew still, as if the entire landscape had paused in quiet reflection. The only sounds were the soft rhythm of Buck's hooves and the occasional call of a distant owl. Jim was tired, hungry, and eager to find a spot to rest, but something tugged at his instincts, that sixth sense cowboys developed after years of riding alone through uncertain lands. That's when he saw it. Just ahead, off to the right, beneath a sparse grove of trees, was a small figure. At first, Jim thought it might be an animal, perhaps a coyote or deer bedding down for the night. But as he drew closer, he realized it was something or someone else entirely. He pulled Buck to a gentle stop, narrowing his eyes against the dim light. Sitting there, almost swallowed by the shadows of the low trees, was a child. A boy, still as stone, arms wrapped tightly around his knees, head slightly bowed but alert enough to notice Jim's presence. His posture wasn't relaxed, but tense, not out of mischief or defiance, but fear. Jim slowly dismounted, landing with a soft thud on the dry earth. His instincts, honed by years of frontier life, told him to move carefully. You never knew what might be hiding in the shadows or who might be watching. But as he walked a few paces closer, all he saw was the boy. Alone, silent, fragile. The child was Native American, no older than 7 or 8. His clothes were tattered and dust-covered, clearly worn for days without change. He had no shoes, and his bare feet were bruised and cracked. His long black hair was tangled and fell across his face. but Jim could see his eyes, large, dark, and hollow, staring not at him, but beyond him, like he was looking through time. Jim crouched a few feet away and spoke gently, keeping his voice low and calm. "Hey there, little fella, you all right?" The boy didn't answer, didn't even flinch. It was as though the question hadn't reached him at all, or he was too afraid to respond. His arms remained locked around his knees, his lips dry and slightly parted. His breathing was shallow and uneven, a quiet gasp of someone who had run too far or gone without food and water for too long. Jim felt a tightness in his chest. This wasn't just a child out late. This was a child lost, possibly orphaned. There was no sign of others nearby, no campsite, no horse, no footprints leading in or out of the grove. It was as if the boy had simply appeared out of the earth, like a ghost left behind by a forgotten tragedy. "You hungry?" Jim asked, softer now. This time, there was a flicker of life in the boy's expression, a subtle shift. The barest nod. Jim reached into his saddlebag and felt the familiar wrap of his last piece of bread. He'd been saving it for himself, a meager supper before sleep, but in that moment, it didn't feel right to hold on to it. Not while this child sat here, hollow-eyed and starving. He unwrapped it slowly, as if offering a sacred object, and extended his hand. The boy looked at the bread, then at Jim. Suspicion and hunger wrestled in his eyes. Slowly, hesitantly, the boy reached out and took it. His hands were small and shaking. He didn't devour the bread immediately. Instead, he held it for a moment, almost as if he wasn't sure it was real. Then, carefully, he brought it to his mouth and took a bite. Jim watched in silence. He didn't speak, didn't smile. He just let the boy eat, letting the moment be what it needed to be. Quiet, human, real. He had no idea who the boy was or where he had come from, but he knew enough. Someone had left him behind, and the world had nearly swallowed him whole. Tonight, however, he wouldn't go hungry. Jim's act was small, even unremarkable by some standards, a man sharing his last bit of food. But out there, in the vast loneliness of the West, that one gesture would ripple through the lives of hundreds. A simple choice, made in silence, would soon become the beginning of something far greater. Jim sat back on his heels as the boy took another small bite of the bread, chewing slowly, as if savoring each morsel like it was the finest meal he'd ever tasted. His hands trembled with every motion, not just from hunger, but from exhaustion and fear. There was a hollowness in his eyes that no child should ever carry, the kind born from deep loss, from seeing too much of the world too soon. Jim said nothing. He didn't ask the boy what had happened to him, didn't press him with questions about where he came from or who he belonged to. He could tell the answers wouldn't come easily if they came at all. Sometimes silence tells a story better than words ever could. And this boy's silence was loud. He glanced down at the now empty saddlebag that had held his last piece of bread. It wasn't much. It hadn't been fresh, just a dialed hunk of sourdough wrapped in cloth. But it had been enough to get him through one more cold night. Jim had been saving it for when he stopped to camp later, maybe with a little coffee boiled over a fire, maybe not. But now, looking at the child's sunken cheeks and the gratitude buried beneath his tired eyes, Jim felt no regret. In fact, he felt strangely full, not in his stomach, but in his soul, in a world that often demanded toughness and taught men to fend for themselves. Jim had learned over the years that kindness wasn't weakness. It was power, quiet, patient, and rare. He knew men who'd killed for less than a loaf of bread, men who saw charity as foolishness. But Jim had also seen death too many times to believe that life should be hoarded. If a man had the chance to give something, anything, and he chose not to, then he was already empty inside. The boy looked up at him after a while, chewing the last bit of crust. His lips moved like he wanted to say something, a thank you, maybe, but no words came out. Instead, he lowered his eyes again and pulled his knees a little closer to his chest. The gesture wasn't cold. It was cautious, like someone who wanted to trust but didn't remember how. Jim stood slowly, brushing the dust from his worn jeans. He walked back to Buck and gave the horse a reassuring pat on the neck. The animal huffed softly, as if sensing something sacred had just passed between his rider and the child. Jim reached into the saddlebag again, out of habit, knowing there was nothing left to find. No food, just a flask of water and a worn map he hadn't looked at in days. He pulled out the flask and turned back to Ward. The boy. "Here," he said, offering it. "Drink slow." The boy reached out again, still careful, still quiet. He took a few sips, then handed it back with both hands, the only gesture of trust he'd made. Jim gave him a nod, took a small sip himself, and tucked the flask away. The sky was darker now. Night was truly coming, and the wind carried a sharper edge. Jim considered making a fire, but he didn't want to frighten the boy. He looked around the grove. It was a decent enough place to rest. The trees offered some shelter, and the ground was soft with fallen leaves. "You can stay here," Jim said gently, motioning to a flat spot beneath one of the larger trees. "I'll be a ways over there if you need anything." The boy didn't answer, but he didn't run either. Jim walked a few paces away, rolled out his thin blanket on the dirt, and sat down. He leaned back against the trunk of a tree, arms crossed, and let out a long breath. The hunger in his stomach gnawed a little louder now, but he ignored it. Somehow, the sacrifice felt right. A man's worth, he believed, wasn't measured by how much he could take, but by how much he could give when it mattered. And tonight, Jim Carson had given everything he had left. He didn't know it, but this simple act of kindness, a piece of bread handed silently to a scared, starving child, would echo far beyond the quiet trees that surrounded them. It would travel across miles of open land and into the hearts of hundreds. But for now, all that existed was a cowboy, a child, and the kind of quiet that only comes after doing something deeply, unmistakably human. The night deepened over the prairie, and the stars multiplied across the vast sky like scattered diamonds. A gentle breeze moved through the trees, whispering through the leaves like a lullaby from a forgotten time. The world had grown quiet, save for the soft rustle of wind and the occasional creak of Jim's saddle as he adjusted his position beneath the tree. He glanced over at the boy, who had curled up against the base of another tree, using his own arm as a pillow. He looked small, fragile, a living reminder of how brutal the world could be, even to the innocent. But now, with a little food in his stomach and the safety of another soul nearby, the tension had eased from his body. Jim wasn't sure if the boy had fallen asleep or was simply resting with his eyes closed, but he didn't disturb him. Some wounds needed silence to begin healing. Jim lay awake longer than usual that night. He watched the stars shift across the sky and listened to the steady rhythm of his horse chewing on a patch of grass. He wasn't thinking about himself, or even the trail ahead. His mind kept returning to the child. Where had he come from? Had his family been attacked, or lost in a storm, or taken by illness? Was he truly alone in the world now, or was someone still searching for him? These were questions Jim had no answers to, and he wasn't sure he ever would. The only thing he knew for certain was that the boy had needed help, and Jim had offered what little he had without hesitation. That, to him, was enough. By the time the first blush of dawn began to color the eastern sky, Jim had made up his mind. He wouldn't press the boy with questions. He wouldn't try to force conversation or comfort. He had done his part, offered food, safety, and quiet companionship, and now it was time to move on. That was the cowboy way. Come in quietly, do what needed to be done, and leave before the dust settled. He stood and began to pack up his things, rolling his blanket tightly and securing it to his saddle. He moved slowly, making just enough noise to let the boy know he was preparing to leave, but not so much that it felt like a goodbye. When he finally turned back, the boy was awake, sitting up now, arms still hugging his knees. He looked at Jim, with a face still marked by uncertainty, but something had changed in his eyes, a flicker of recognition, maybe even trust. It wasn't much, but it was something. Jim gave a small nod, almost like a bow. "You're safe here," he said simply. "Stay in the trees during the day. Head east. When you're ready, there's a river about a day's walk from here. Might be some folks there who can help." The boy didn't respond, but his eyes stayed on Jim. Jim reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small item, a silver button from an old vest he used to wear. It wasn't worth much, but it was something solid, something the boy could hold on to. He tossed it gently toward the ground near the boy's feet. "For luck," he said. Then, without another word, he mounted Buck. The horse gave a soft grunt as Jim settled into the saddle. He looked one last time at the boy, then turned west, toward the rising sun, and nudged the horse forward. He didn't look back. The ride was slow at first. His body ached from the cold night, and his stomach growled with the hunger he had chosen the night before. But inside, there was a quiet strength, a sense of rightness that carried him more surely than the horse beneath him. Behind him, in the shaded grove, the boy remained seated, still clutching the silver button, and though Jim would never know it, the boy would remember that morning for the rest of his life, not just for the bread, or the water, or the token left behind, but for the simple truth that someone, somewhere, had seen him and chosen to care. It was a silent departure. No farewell, no promise of return, just two souls whose paths had crossed briefly beneath the stars, and a kindness that would echo far louder than words ever could. The sun had fully risen by the time Jim Carson crested the final ridge that overlooked the small frontier town of Dry Creek. It was a modest settlement, tucked between two sloping hills and bordered by a lazy stream that shimmered in the morning light. A few thin columns of smoke curled into the sky from chimneys, and the faint sounds of wagons and livestock drifted through the air. It was the kind of town Jim had passed through dozens of times, quiet, worn by time, and surviving on grit and grit alone. But today, something was different. Even from a distance, Jim could tell that something unusual was happening. There were figures gathered near the eastern edge of the town, where the main dirt road curved around a bend and widened into an open clearing. He slowed Buck to a cautious walk, his hand drifting instinctively toward the handle of his revolver. Though he didn't draw it, tension crawled up his spine. Cowboys like him didn't walk into surprises unprepared. As he drew nearer, the figures came into focus. Not townsfolk, not soldiers, but warriors. hundreds of them lined up in silence. They stood in 2 long, perfectly still rows on either side of the road, facing inward, creating a path down the center. There must have been 500, maybe more, native warriors of the same tribe as the boy he had met. Their faces were painted with solemn patterns, their bodies wrapped in leather, bone, and beads. Feathers adorned their hair. Many held spears or bows, but none made a move. Their expressions were calm, unreadable, but not hostile. But it was not an ambush, it was something else. Jim felt his throat tighten as he instinctively slowed, bucked to a halt just at the edge of the line. The air buzzed with intensity, though no one said a word. The silence was deep, not just quiet, but purposeful. It was the kind of silence that holds meaning, that commands respect, that speaks louder than any shout ever could. A murmur rippled through the townspeople who had begun to gather nearby. Shopkeepers stood on porches. Children peeked from behind barrels. Even the sheriff stood stiffly near his office, one hand resting on the butt of his holstered weapon, but his eyes were wide with disbelief. Never before had so many members of a native tribe entered a town like Dry Creek, and certainly not in silence, not in peace, and not like this. Jim dismounted, slowly, leaving his rifle in its scabbard and keeping his hands visible. He was no stranger to the tribes. He had worked with them, ridden alongside them, and even fought against them in the chaos of younger years. But this was new. This was sacred. And then, from among the sea of still warriors, a man stepped forward. He was older, tall, and commanding, with feathers in his braided hair and a necklace of polished stones across his chest. His face was painted in a ceremonial design, and his eyes, dark, calm, and powerful, locked directly with Jim's. The chief. He walked alone down the path between the rows of warriors until he stood before Jim. For a long moment, they just looked at each other. No words, no gestures, just mutual recognition. Then slowly, the chief extended his hand. Jim hesitated only a second before grasping it. The chief's grip was firm but respectful, not a show of dominance, but a gesture of brotherhood. You gave your bread, the chief said, his voice deep and clear, to a child who had none. That child was ours. His parents were taken by sickness. His spirit wandered, alone, and you saw him. Jim didn't know what to say. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't done it for recognition. He'd barely thought of it again, except for the hunger in his own belly. He'd simply seen a child in need and had done what felt right. The chief stepped aside and gestured toward the long, silent ranks of warriors. We honor you today, not as a stranger, not as an outsider, but as one who carries the spirit of the wolf and the heart of the wind. You are now known to our people. You are welcome among us. The warriors, still silent, gave a small nod in unison, subtle, powerful, and deeply respectful. And in that moment, Jim Carson, a quiet, wandering cowboy, realized something rare had happened. A single, simple act of kindness had bridged a gap forged by centuries of distance, distrust, and division. And now, he stood at the center of something far greater than himself. Jim stood motionless for a moment, his weathered hand still grasping the chief's, the weight of the moment pressing heavy on his shoulders. He had faced danger before: outlaws, wild animals, gunmen who'd shoot a man just for looking at them wrong, but nothing quite like this. This wasn't fear, it was something deeper. Something that shook him at the core in a way bullets and fists never could. He had not expected thanks. He certainly had not expected a tribal honor ceremony. What was unfolding before him felt almost surreal. The chief released his hand, and Jim took a small step back, scanning the rows of warriors once more. Not one of them had moved from their place. No murmurs, no shifting feet, just silence. A respectful, impenetrable silence that seemed to stretch across time and space. It was the kind of silence usually reserved for prayer or judgment, and Jim couldn't help but wonder which one this was. He turned slightly, glancing toward the townsfolk now gathered in growing numbers behind him. Their faces were painted with awe, confusion, and in some cases, fear. Jim could see the sheriff, whispering to one of his deputies, eyes fixed on the gathered warriors. Mothers clutched their children tightly. Some men kept their hands near their holsters, uncertain whether what they were witnessing was peace or the calm before a storm. Jim felt the tension growing around him, and it made his stomach twist. What had he done to cause all this? It had only been a piece of bread, a small, simple act done with no thought of reward. Yet here he was surrounded by 500 warriors, standing between two worlds that had rarely seen each other without violence or distrust. He looked at the chief, again, trying to read his expression. It wasn't anger. In fact, the elder's face was calm, almost reverent. But still, Jim needed to ask, why? Jim's voice cracked slightly from dryness and disbelief. He cleared his throat. Why all this? I only gave the boy a little food, that's all. The chief studied him for a long moment before speaking. To you, it was a piece of bread, he said slowly, his voice filled with quiet power. To him, it was hope. He did not pass him by. You did not see him as less than a man, or something strange, or someone to fear. You saw a child. And in doing so, you reminded us of something sacred: compassion. Jim lowered his gaze. The words humbled him in a way he wasn't prepared for. He hadn't seen himself as noble or brave, just a tired man who'd done what he hoped someone else might have done in his place. Had the roles been reversed, he felt exposed now, like a man caught in a storm with no shelter. The attention made him uneasy. He'd always lived his life in the quiet corners of the world, riding trails few traveled, staying clear of glory or spotlight. He wasn't used to being the center of anything, let alone something this large. "I didn't do it for thanks," he said softly. "We know," the chief replied, nodding. "That is why it matters." The warriors remained still, but Jim could feel their presence like a wall at his back, a living monument to honor. He took a slow, deep breath, still not quite sure how to feel. Gratitude, confusion, maybe even guilt. So many times in his life, he had walked past people in need, too tired, too hungry, too hardened to care. And yet this one time, when he had acted without hesitation, the universe had answered with something far greater than he could comprehend. Behind him, one of the townspeople called out, "Jim, you okay?" He turned slightly and gave a nod, though he wasn't entirely sure of the answer himself. He was okay, but changed, touched by something ancient and honorable. The chief raised his hand and signaled quietly. In one fluid motion, the warriors began to disperse, still silent, still solemn. They disappeared into the trees like mist, returning to the earth, leaving behind nothing but the echo of their presence and the message they had come to deliver. And just like that, they were gone. Jim stood alone, once again, the dust of the road swirling softly around his boots. The townsfolk began to murmur, their voices rising with speculation and awe, but Jim didn't hear them. Not really. He was still standing in that long corridor of silence, still trying to understand how something so small could become something so great. He mounted Buck and took one last look down the road, the same way he had come. The boy was nowhere in sight, but Jim didn't need to see him to know. Their paths had crossed for a reason, and something had shifted in the world because of it. Jim remained still in his saddle for a long while, staring at the now empty path where hundreds of warriors had stood moments ago. The air still felt charged, like the trail itself held on to the echo of their presence. He had faced many crossroads in his life, some literal, some not, but this one was different. This one had been paved, not with choices about survival or danger, but with something more human, recognition, respect, and something that felt dangerously close to belonging. And that feeling was unfamiliar to a man like Jim Carson. He'd always been on the outside, a wanderer, a cowboy who moved from town to town, hired for work, never staying long enough for anyone to remember his name after he left. His presence was usually forgotten as soon as the dust settled behind his horse's hooves. That was how he liked it, or at least, that's what he had told himself for years. But now, after what had just happened, he wasn't so sure. He slowly rode into Dry Creek, and the people of the town, still gathered in small stunned clusters, parted to make way for him. No one jeered, no one asked questions. There was something unspoken passing between them, something between respect and awe. Even those who had looked suspiciously at the warriors earlier now kept their eyes down as Jim passed, tipping hats or nodding silently. For once, he wasn't just a quiet stranger riding in. He was something else now. He dismounted in front of the sheriff's office, where Sheriff Wilkes, a burly man with graying sideburns, stepped forward and met him with a look that was neither confrontational nor dismissive, just curious. "You want to tell me what just happened out there, Jim?" the sheriff asked, voice low. Jim shook his head slightly. "I don't reckon I could, even if I tried." The sheriff scratched the back of his neck. "Well, whatever it was, it sure was something. Never seen the likes of that. Not here, not anywhere." Jim gave a quiet nod, his eyes distant. "Me neither." Just then, a soft voice came from the edge of the crowd. It was the boy. He stood there barefoot, small among the towering adults, clutching the silver button Jim had given him the night before. No longer hiding in the trees, no longer curled in fear. He had followed the warriors, it seemed, and now stood on the edge of two worlds, his and Jim's. The crowd grew silent as the boy walked forward and stood beside Jim. No words were spoken, none were needed. Jim looked down at him, and the boy looked up, eyes clearer now, filled with a quiet sense of safety. At that moment, something profound settled over the crowd. The sheriff removed his hat. A few others followed. It wasn't a grand ceremony, not like what had happened outside the gates. But in its own way, it was just as meaningful. It was a recognition that something rare had occurred, something not measured by laws or boundaries, but by hearts. Later that afternoon, a few members of the tribe returned, not in war paint, not in formation, but in friendship. They brought gifts, woven blankets, handmade beads, and smoked meat wrapped in palm leaves. Jim was led to a small gathering near the river, just beyond the town, where a circle was formed. There, among the elders and the youth, Jim was given a new name in their tradition, Tazwa Khan, the sacred bread giver. The name wasn't loud or flashy, but it meant everything. It meant he had not only given food to a starving child, he had restored dignity, built a bridge, and reminded everyone that kindness still had a place in a world growing harder by the day. From that day forward, whenever Jim passed through a town, he was no longer just a cowboy with a dusty hat and a worn saddle. He was the man who had been honored by a nation. The man who had stood quietly and been recognized not for what he had, but for what he gave. He didn't talk about it much. When asked, he'd shrug it off, maybe share a quiet smile. But in his heart, something had shifted. He no longer saw himself as an outsider. He had been seen, truly seen, and welcomed by those who rarely opened their arms to the world. And perhaps, for the first time in a long time, Jim Carson felt like he belonged, not just to a tribe or a town, but to something greater. In the weeks and months that followed, the story of Jim Carson, the quiet cowboy who gave his last piece of bread to a starving native orphan, spread far and wide across the frontier. At first, it was just a whisper in Dry Creek, a tale passed between neighbors and travelers over campfires and saloon counters. But the story had a weight to it, a truth so pure and powerful that it couldn't help but grow. It reached towns Jim had never visited. It traveled with horse traders and mail couriers, rode in the wagons of migrating settlers, and echoed in the songs of tribal drummers across distant plains. People didn't remember the exact day it happened, or the full name of the child involved, but they remembered the cowboy, the man who had nothing, yet gave everything. Some stories are fueled by drama or violence, gunfights, robberies, frontier justice, but this story was different. This story was about quiet strength, the kind that doesn't come from fists or firepower, but from character. It was about a man who did good when no one was watching, who acted from instinct rather than intention, and who never asked for a single thing in return. Over time, Jim became a kind of legend, not the kind etched in stone or sung by bells with silver tongues, but the kind that lived in the quiet hearts of those who believed the world could still be better than it was. Parents told their children the tale as a bedtime story. Tribal elders retold it during sacred gatherings, not to glorify the cowboy, but to honor the values he had embodied: compassion, humility, and unity. Back in Dry Creek, the sheriff had a small plaque made from pine wood and hung it in the town hall. It read simply, "One loaf, 500 warriors, one act, endless peace." Travelers would pause to read it, not always knowing the full story, but feeling the gravity of it anyway. Jim himself didn't change much after that day. He didn't settle down or seek fame. He still rode from town to town, helping where he could, working when there was work, resting when there wasn't. But people looked at him differently now. When he walked into a town, he was no longer just another drifter. He was a symbol of something good, something rare. And though he never sought thanks, gratitude found him in quiet ways. A stable hand would refuse his payment for feed. A store clerk would slip an extra loaf of bread into his bag. Children would run up to him with wide eyes, asking, "Are you the one who helped the boy?" He never said yes, but he never denied it either. He'd simply tip his hat, give a small smile, and move on. But the greatest legacy of all wasn't carved into wood or whispered in stories. It was the boy. He had remained with the tribe, growing stronger each day. He learned the old ways, the language, the medicine, the stories. And as he grew, he often asked about the man who had helped him, the man who had given him bread when no one else would. The boy, now a young man, carried that act in his heart like a fire that never went out. Years later, he would become a respected leader among his people, a voice for peace, a builder of bridges between cultures, a protector of the forgotten. And whenever anyone asked him what had shaped him, what had shown him the path of hope, he would always tell them the same thing. It started with a piece of bread, and a cowboy who saw me. The world, harsh and wild as it often was, had been changed, not by force or conquest, but by the simplest act of all, kindness. And though Jim Carson's name may have faded from the pages of history books, his legacy lived on in the footsteps of that boy, in the silence of 500 warriors, and in every soul who chose to give, even when they had little left. Because sometimes, the smallest gesture in the quietest moment can echo louder than a lifetime of words.